Great and powerful Oz!
To understand what Catholics and Copts and Orthodox and actual all Christians think like, you have to learn to think in analogy. The language does this, right? You have a word that you're mapping onto, and what you were saying earlier, Kilts, about we use white and then it can mean these multiple things. And then you're saying the context means that you don't know which one it is. Language has this ambiguity so that it can mean multiple things. We're used to all of this conjuration, to use a loaded term, in our ordinary exercise of our imagination. It's interesting that then when we can bring it into liturgy, we bring it into the understanding of the divine, people suddenly forget how to think in correspondences and references.
Yeah, because the West has been liturgically damaged. It doesn't think in image language anymore, and it doesn't think in ritualized language anymore in the sense of Christianity, as much as other parts of the world do, at least in my experience. Because the more the smells and bells are bleached out of the liturgical practice, the less to read in the liturgy. And by reading, I don't mean like alphabetic reading. I mean reading in the symbolic behavior and the patterns of the liturgy and the icons. And what the priest is doing, we're reading it as we're going through, but it's not just with the eyes, it's multisensorial literacy. And this is not normal for white people. When they think about Christianity, usually they're thinking like Anglo-Protestants in Australia. It's like you go into the building, you say some prayers, everything's nice, it's all very polite, blah, 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 blah.
Their walls are all white. Maybe this is what white supremacy is.
Yeah.
It's their walls. They whitewashed over all of the art.
Iconoclasm.
It's iconoclasm. White supremacy. There, we've solved it. It's iconoclasm. It's erasing all of the art, so all you see are the white walls.
Yeah, no color. Icons, no color.
No icons, no color. We are all convinced in our imaginative theater going that we can see dragons. No, it's just Benedict Cumberbatch in a weird light thing so that they can film him making faces crawling around on the floor so that they can CGI guys can put the smog on him, and there we have dragons. Above a Comedy Central one where they have smog in the outfit to do the image capture. It's pretty funny. The dragon doesn't exist. Cumberbatch obviously can do smog, and they have him crawling around on the ground so they can image capture his body movements to make a realistic dragon, and then project it onto this screen that the actors have to perform in front of without ever being able to see what they're doing. Kind of like Gregory the Great at the Mass.
The multi-dimensional experience of being a green screen actor.
Gregory the Great did it first. Because one of the things that Caroline, I think I said this, but I'll repeat it. It's like Caroline said, not everybody in the scene necessarily seems to see what's going on. In that the green screen space of wherever the Man of Sorrows is being realized. And yet you as the viewer of the painting, as indeed the viewer of the movie, there is some sense of that is more real than the reality we have as the audience. That the smog is more real. These dragons are real than you watching Benedict Cumberbatch pretend to be the dragon. Like when you go to the movie, you believe that that's the dragon, or at least some part of you wants to believe. You have that desire for dragons that Tolkien talks about, desperately wanting them to be there. Why? Right, and the sort of mystery of what the dragon realm is. Tolkien was obviously Catholic, and so probably everything that he's doing has a liturgical resonance that you want to pay attention for.
Yeah, it smells and bells in theaters, the bombardment of the senses in order to activate the imagination.
What I was thinking about with the green screens, it's like most of us know watching the CGI, it's not real. They had to film Cumberbatch making smog because there needed to be some kind of real body behind all the CGI. It's not convincing just to make the animations. They all, they need the voices, or maybe the AI will do the voices, who knows. But we do seem to be able to tell the difference between it's totally fake and there's human reality within it.
The faces. Something about it, I think this is why the iconography is so important, because if you're in pure animation, you've removed the real human face. But those kinds of blends with the actor in front of a green screen, they can do all sorts of things, but the human face is still there. So it's tolerable as this kind of blend of art and reality. It's a kind of icon as opposed to making something completely artificial.
I like what you're saying, but it needs to have that human face, the mirror of even the monsters. Right. The dragons are more realistic to us insofar as they image us. When we're watching the movies, it is funny going through it, sort of finding all of the ways in which they use these green screen prop guys to make the magic happen, that they're powers. right? That there are actual powers out there. She has to hand the book to actual human beings. But in the movie, they green screen out the hands. So it looks like the books are shelving themselves. The feeling of power that all of these effects creates is, again, there's a human agent behind it. I mean, we're always somehow that we're constantly making these activities in the fantasy realm that still have the mark of our humanity on them.
We're still participating. We're not just observing. When Hermione's handing the books to those green screen hands, it's almost like we're becoming the green screen hands for the priest in a lot of ways. We're there, but the priest isn't really paying much attention to us for the majority of Mass. But if we aren't there, there isn't a liturgy. It's the same with the altar servers, which are sort of doing a similar thing. They're there, but they're not there. A magic spell can be done in solitude. A liturgy cannot be done in solitude. That green screen activity would be impossible without people's hands popping out of the bookcase. It's participatory.
Everything that we're doing is drawing out for me what Tolkien describes about fairy. Realm as a place we want to go in our stories and our imagination. He has a long discussion of how drama doesn't work as well as literature, because acting it all out is very, very hard to make it look real. The green screen and the CGI is all trying to do the magic that Tolkien says on stage you can't achieve it. In the opening of Fairy Stories, I think he says, I propose to speak about fairy stories, though I'm aware that this is a rash adventure. This is Tolkien, so every word is like 18 references that he's speaking about fairy stories, and it's an adventure. Rashly. And that's even his name, right? In the Notion Club papers, he's Rash Bold. Referent. Fairy is a perilous land. So he said he's going to speak about fairy stories, and what he immediately starts talking about is realm, right? Is a perilous land, and in it are pitfalls for the unwary and dungeons for the overbold. And overbold I may be accounted, for though I have been a lover of fairy stories since I learned to read, and have at times thought about them, I have not studied them professionally. Snicker. That's basically all he does. I have been hardly more than a wandering explorer or trespasser in the land, full of wonder, but not of information. The realm of fairy story is wide and deep and high and filled with many things. All manner of beasts and birds are found there, shoreless seas and stars uncounted. Beauty that is an enchantment and an ever-present peril, both joy and sorrow as sharp as swords. In that realm a man may perhaps count himself fortunate to have wandered, but its very richness and strangeness tie the tongue of a traveler who would report them. And while he is there, it is dangerous for him to ask too many questions, lest the gates should be shut and the keys be lost. It's very easy to say, okay, so he's just described fairy, and of course it's dangerous and perilous. But there's other things that are like clues that he's really actually talking about something else, that it's an enchantment, that it's beautiful. That it has joy and sorrow as sharp as swords. The dragon had the trademark of fairy written plain upon him. I desire dragons with a profound desire. The dragons take you there. So what is it? What is fairy? What is he describing? Dangerous, full of joy and sorrow and peril.
That sounds like being in love, doesn't it?
But it's a place. He means it as it's a specific realm. He spends a lot of time describing how to get there. And language is a lot of it. We've been touching on words and spells and things like that. He's doing it by way of a particular kind of crafting of language. He has talking about adjectives and green suns. The desire for it and the longing to be able to see and visit, and the way he describes it. He's setting up a very particular kind of longing for that realm.
It's like the transcendence from the mundane, from the purely carnal world, purely material world.
Well, so interestingly, he says that men are actually supernatural, unlike fairies. We actually have a supernatural element. We have souls. One of the things he says fairy stories do is enable us to see our world more clearly. Fairy stories as a whole have three faces. The mystical towards the supernatural, which is when we're thinking about fantasy, it's like, oh, dragons are supernatural. Not exactly. Mystically, they point to the supernatural, which he says men are, but elves aren't. So there's something about our immortality in the mystic. There's something natural in magic, not supernatural, just natural. The mirror of scorn and pity towards man. You get when you say the elves have powers that we don't, but they're a mirror, like what we were talking about with the problem of being able to see our own face in the dragons.
This experience we have when we're looking at icons too. The icons are mirrors for us as a race, as humanity, but also for ourselves as individuals. We're talking with a saint. We're having this experience, transcending time, because they don't live in time. They live in the eternal, but they're talking to us in time. So we've left this natural into the supernatural. In talking with them, we see their holiness contrasted with our sinfulness, staring at elves' experience. You're wondering how holy they are, or how holy they were and are because it's both at the same time and considering your own spiritual condition.
You think Tolkien went to Mass?
Probably a couple of times.
Daily. He has in one of his letters talking to Christopher how, in the Mass is all of this. It's the drama of everything is in the Mass. It's romance, it's tragedy. Tolkien is actually describing in this essay on fairy stories is his experience of liturgy. Stories about fairy, that is fairy, the realm or state in which fairies have their being. Fairy contains many things besides elves and fays, besides dwarfs, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth, and all things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. Remember, he said that at the beginning. Beauty that is an enchantment. Fairy is enchanted, full of joy and sorrow, sharp as swords. Now, maybe you have to have spent your entire life thinking about Mary. Catch the referent there. Her joys, her sorrows, and swords that pierce her soul. So we have here Gandalf weeping in front of a green screen because he's trying to act to nobody. No, there's this problem to put Frodo or Bilbo in the scene with him. They had to green screen them in, and to make the Hobbit small, they had to film them separately. So here is Ian McKellen as Gandalf, green screened with no audience for his acting. There's a priest offering the Mass in front of an altar in which there's nothing. Alice going into Wonderland from the Tim Burton movie where pretty much all of it's green screen. Everything that the actors had to do, imagining what the scene would be if, just like Gregory at the Mass, imagining what those with faith can see in his sacrifice, the actors are having to do in front of these green screens on these sets. Tolkien's doing that all the time, right? And he's thinking about, because of language, because you're able to do this with the enchantment of your words. Enchantment requires language. In English,
Chanting.
It's chanting. Right? It's the spell casting of singing of the liturgy, the enchantment, the beauty that we experience in that enchantment, and the happy ending, which he describes as the eucatastrophe, this joyous turn, the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn, for there is no true end to any fairy tale. This joy, which is one of the things which fairy stories can produce supremely well, which he's saying is not as simply escapist or fugitive. In its fairy tale or otherworld setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace. No word with Tolkien is ever accidental. Never to be counted on or to recur. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat. Insofar is Evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. Wait, Evangelium? Wait, what's that?
The Evangel. The Gospel.
I get it like massively fairy tale-y weepy at this point too, because it's always the tears of the eucatastrophe, the breaking through into, and this is where he goes in the epilogue. The Gospels contain a fairy story or story of a larger kind which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation.
He's our consolation, the end of our grief, at the beginning of our joy, is the incarnation of the Son of God in the Virgin Mary, and the enchantment of the world, the re-enchantment of the world, because we suddenly have a name that we didn't have before. Gabriel announced the pregnancy to the Virgin, which is Emmanuel. You will call him Emmanuel, God with us. We live in a different time, different dimensional experience of space-time after the incarnation of Christ.
Well, and it's what I see in this, in the theatrical longing, the Mad Hatter walking, supported by all of these green screen guys, actually physically carrying them. I didn't realize that in watching the movie, right? It's like you see it that it's all green screen. There were physically prop guys having to carry these women on these litters. It's very medieval. Cleopatra or something. Over and over again in our movie industry, we're doing exactly what Tolkien is describing in this longing for dragons, longing for the reality of fairy, to enter into it, for it to be real. What we're always wanting, and what he says we're always wanting with the fairy stories, is to be in that story, which we are actually in. Right. It's his famous phrase, legend and history have met and fused. In the gospel, the myth and the history are both real. And so this longing for the reality of fairy, it's the longing for the secondary realm, he says, that you create through the storytelling. That he is, in fact, throughout this essay describing the Mass, going through that portal of enchantment into that realm where joy and sorrow are blended in song, which is what happens at the end of Lord of the Rings when they have the song of the minstrel on the field of Cormala. You find yourself in the story, and the story is now being chanted, and you are in that story. It's the liturgy. All of this fantasy work that we're doing in this green screening of the movies is clearly participating in that longing, which is what Tolkien describes as the resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. This story begins and ends in joy. It has preeminently the inner consistency of reality, which is what he said successful fairy stories have, that they have this sense of it's real. It's real. You want it to believe it's real, right? There is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. For the art of it has the supremely convincing tone of primary art, that is, of creation. To reject it leads either to sadness or to wrath.
Like love.